March 2024, they opened the container and froze. A girl, untouched by time, perfectly preserved, her features intact after 59 years. A wealthy collector spent $3 million on what he was told was a rare Victorian doll, lifelike, perfectly preserved and haunting in its beauty. A few months later, he hired an expert to verify its value. Something about the craftsmanship felt unusual. The texture, the weight, the hair. The expert insists on a CT scan. The result of the test revealed a terrifying nightmare. Samuel Archer, a self-made tech entrepreneur and avid collector, had always been drawn to the strange and extraordinary. His Manhattan penthouse was filled with rare artifacts and forgotten masterpieces, but nothing had captivated him like the piece Jonathan Blake showed him that cold March afternoon. It felt too real, almost alive, and soon Samuel would realize that some things are far stranger than they appear. Years earlier, Samuel once joked that he collected things that seemed to watch him back. He never imagined that one of them truly would. The scan was only the beginning, because inside that body wasn't just a secret, it was a message meant for him. But to understand how this all started, we have to go back to the day he first learned about the doll. Most people will scroll away and forget this ever happened. But not you. You have stayed. So kindly subscribe, because some mind-blowing stories are coming your way. The antique shop sat tucked inside a narrow brownstone on the Upper East Side, unmarked, unlisted, and open only to those who already belonged. It was the kind of place where prices were never written down, and the air itself seemed to hum with quiet secrecy. Jonathan Blake, silver-haired and faultlessly dressed, had called Samuel directly days earlier. His voice carried the confidence of a man who'd found something the world wasn't meant to have. "I have something extraordinary," he'd said. "Something I think you'll appreciate." Now, inside the shop's dim private gallery, Samuel understood the secrecy. Under soft lighting, behind glass, stood the figure Blake had promised, a young woman frozen in time. The gown was deep burgundy silk, Victorian in style, heavy with age. Her hair, glossy, dark and human, fell neatly over her shoulders. Her hands rested gently at her sides, sculpted with impossible realism. From a distance, she looked alive, almost breathing. Blake approached the display like a priest at an altar. "Late 1800s, he murmured. "European work, likely French. The documentation is incomplete, but the quality speaks for itself. Observe the material, wax or resin, something rare for its time. See the eyes? See the human hair? Hand-blown glass, the kind you don't find anymore? They seem to look through you, don't they?" Samuel didn't answer. He was too focused on the face, on the faint warmth of the skin tone, the natural crease beneath the lip, the faintest shadow of veins beneath the surface. It was beauty suspended between art and something disturbingly real. Blake smiled knowingly. "Pieces like this, they don't just appear, they survive." Samuel's pulse quickened. He didn't realize yet that what he was looking at hadn't merely survived, it had been preserved. Years earlier, Samuel had told a journalist he admired collectors who kept history alive. He never thought the phrase would turn literal. Samuel moved slowly around the glass enclosure, unable to look away. Every step revealed another small perfection. The soft bend of the wrist, the faint dimples at the corners of her mouth, even the dusting of freckles over her nose, details too intimate, too precise to belong to a sculpture. The longer he stared, the more his curiosity blurred into unease. "How much?" he asked quietly. His voice sounding distant even to himself. Blake didn't hesitate. For a collector who understands what he's looking at, $1 million, Samuel didn't flinch. The number should have made him pause, but it didn't. Something about the figure felt almost pleading, like it wanted to be seen again after being hidden for too long. Buying it didn't feel like acquisition. It felt like release. 10 days later, after papers were signed and the payment cleared, the figure was transported to Samuel's penthouse under strict conditions, temperature-controlled, sealed in glass, no direct light. When the crate arrived, the moving team handled it like an artifact from another world. At first, Samuel visited it every evening. He would pour himself a drink, dim the lights, and simply observe, studying how shadows changed the contours of its face, how the eyes seemed to follow him. He told himself it was craftsmanship, but sometimes as he turned to leave, he could swear the expression shifted. Just slightly, there was something sad in that face, a story trapped behind stillness, and Samuel, though he couldn't say why, felt a strange responsibility to uncover it. Years earlier, when Samuel first sold his tech company, he'd told a friend, "I'm done chasing things that don't look back." He didn't realize this one would. Samuel spent the next several weeks trying to trace the figure's history himself. He devoured every reference he could find on Victorian mourning rituals, wax portraiture, and memento mori art, creations meant to immortalize the dead. But nothing he read came close to explaining what stood behind the glass in his penthouse. The craftsmanship was too perfect, too precise. Whoever made it hadn't just tried to preserve beauty, they'd tried to preserve life itself. Samuel decided it was time to bring in an expert. He told himself it was for insurance paperwork, but he knew better. He wanted answers. He called Dr. Sarah Williams, a forensic arts specialist he trusted. Her background in both art history and forensic anthropology made her the rare kind of expert who could tell when a piece crossed the line between creation and reality. Sarah arrived on a muted Tuesday morning, the city outside eerily still. Masked and gloved, she carried a sleek black case filled with precision instruments. Samuel led her to the private gallery, heart quickening as her eyes found the figure. "God," she breathed, stepping closer. "Samuel, this is extraordinary." He smiled, relieved. "I knew you'd appreciate it." But as minutes passed, something in her face changed. The wonder dimmed, her brow creased. She examined the hands, the neck, the hairline. The magnifying glass trembled slightly in her grip. She began taking measurements, recording angles, snapping photographs with clinical precision. Samuel stood silent, the sound of the shutter echoing softly through the room. 2 hours passed. With each photo, Sarah's expression darkened. When she finally turned toward him, there was no admiration left in her voice, only unease. Sarah had once helped Samuel expose a forged Renaissance painting years earlier, a discovery that made his name in collecting circles. Back then, they joked that truth hides under the paint. Now, the truth hid under something far worse. Sarah stood in silence for a long moment, the sound of the city faint beyond the penthouse windows. Then she finally exhaled and stepped back from the glass case. "I need to be honest with you," she said. "Something about this piece is bothering me." Samuel frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, eyes flicking back to the figure. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary, no question, but it's almost too accurate. The anatomy, the proportions, the way the joints connect, even the variation in skin texture, it's as if it's been built from something real. The fingernails don't look applied, they look grown. And the pores, Samuel, I can see pores." A cold wave crawled through him. "You're saying—" "What exactly?" "I'm saying," she replied carefully, "before I can appraise this, before I put my name on any certificate, I have to be absolutely certain of what we're dealing with. I want to do a CT scan." He blinked. "A CT scan? Of a doll?" Sarah nodded. "If it's a doll, the scan will confirm it. It'll show the framework, materials, maker's marks, maybe even repairs or internal supports. But if my concerns are correct," she paused, lowering her voice, "then we're not looking at craftsmanship. We're looking at preservation." Samuel stared at the figure through the glass. For the first time since buying it, he felt afraid to be alone in the room. Sarah closed her case and looked at him. Better to find out now than later. Samuel remembered the night he'd first seen it. Blake's words echoing. Pieces like this don't just appear, they survive. He hadn't realized how literal that would sound now. Somewhere out there, another family is still waiting for answers. Subscribe if you believe every missing soul deserves to be found. The CT scan was scheduled for the following week at a private imaging facility. The technicians handled the figure with careful precision, positioning it in the machine without a word of curiosity or judgment. Samuel and Sarah watched from the control room, the hum of the scanner filling the silence. The first images flickered onto the monitors. The technician leaned closer, squinting at the screen. "That's odd," he murmured. "What? What is it?" Samuel asked, stepping forward. The technician adjusted the settings, scrolling through layers, zooming in on subtle patterns. "I'm seeing what appears to be bone density, And here this shadow looks like desiccated soft tissue. Dr. Williams, you should see this. Sarah moved immediately to the console. Her hands hovered over the keyboard as she analyzed each frame, her face paling. Skeletal structures were visible beneath the layers of resin and wax, partially obscured by preservation chemicals. Once the eyes adjusted, there was no mistaking it: bone, cartilage, teeth. The figure was not a creation of artistry alone. The scan was revealing what they had both feared, but the heavy resin and chemical treatments created a confusing overlay that made interpretation difficult. Samuel had once said he collected objects that still had a pulse. He hadn't realized how literal that could become. The images suggested the preservation had been done decades ago, using methods far beyond what should have been possible in the Victorian era, or any era. Whoever had done this had intended it to last. "Get me a clearer image of the cranial structure," Sarah said, her voice tight, "and the thoracic cavity." The technician worked carefully, adjusting filters and contrast. Slowly the outlines sharpened. A skull appeared, hollow eye sockets staring back at them through the screen. Ribs fanned outward, a spine traced like a shadow beneath layers of preservation. "Oh God," Sarah whispered. "Samuel, I need you to step outside for a moment," she said. "What?" "No, tell me what you're seeing," he demanded, gripping the console. Sarah turned to him, eyes wide with genuine fear. "This isn't a doll. I think these are human remains. We need to call the police immediately." The room tilted. Samuel's grip tightened, heart hammering. "That's impossible. It can't be. I bought it from a reputable dealer. It has documentation, provenance. The scan doesn't lie." The technician interjected, pointing at the screen. "See this? That's a human femur. And these are vertebrae. The preservation process obscures the surface, but the underlying structure is clearly human." Sarah was already dialing. "I'm calling NYPD. Samuel, don't touch anything. This is a potential crime." The reality hit Samuel in waves. The piece he had prized above all others, the figure he'd studied for weeks, wasn't art. It was a person, hidden in plain sight for decades. Samuel remembered Blake's words at the shop: "Pieces like this, they survive." He hadn't understood how literal that would be. The scan suggested decades of careful preservation, chemical treatment, and deliberate concealment. Whoever did this had a plan. The hours that followed were a haze. Police arrived, their initial disbelief giving way to grim acceptance as they studied the CT scans. The figure was carefully moved to the medical examiner's office, handled with gloved precision. Detectives took statements from Samuel, Sarah, and the medical staff. By evening, despite efforts to control the story, rumors had leaked to the press. Detective Jack Bauer arrived at Samuel's penthouse just before midnight. A tall man in his early 50s with greying hair and eyes that had seen more than their share of human cruelty. Porter dismissed the uniformed officers after a short discussion and took Samuel aside for a private interview. "Mr. Archer," Porter began, settling into a chair in the living room, "you are not a suspect. But you did purchase human remains, knowingly or not. I need full honesty. Every detail about this acquisition, no matter how small, matters." Samuel recounted everything: Blake's phone call, the private viewing, the price, the paperwork. He handed over copies of all documentation: bills of sale, certificates of authenticity, insurance appraisals, provenance records. Porter examined each piece meticulously, taking notes in silence. "This provenance," he said finally, holding up one of the papers, "traces the figure back to 1963, acquired from a French estate. But that's where the trail stops. No maker's name, no original sale record, nothing before that date." Samuel swallowed hard. A body hidden for 60 years. Paperwork meant to prove legitimacy instead exposed a trail gone cold decades ago, and somewhere in that gap was the truth someone had killed to protect. The French estate mentioned in the paperwork would soon become the focal point of the investigation, and someone who remembered the body's origins was still alive. Blake said that was common with pieces from that era, Samuel explained. Records were often lost or incomplete. "Maybe," Porter said, setting the documents down. "Or maybe someone created a false history to hide what this really is. The medical examiner's office is doing a full analysis. It'll take time, but we should have preliminary results within a week. In the meantime, I need to speak with Jonathan Blake." The next day, Blake met with Porter, cooperative but visibly shaken. He recounted his own history with the piece, detailing how he had purchased it years earlier from an estate sale in Maryland. The seller had been an elderly widow liquidating her late husband's collection. Blake had paid $8,000, believing it to be a genuine Victorian mourning artifact. "I've been in this business for 40 years, Blake said, his hands trembling. "I've handled thousands of pieces. I would never knowingly deal in human remains." The documentation seemed legitimate. The piece had been in that collection for decades. There was no reason to suspect anything unusual. Porter followed the trail. He obtained the Maryland estate sale records and contacted the auction house that had handled the sale. The paper trail led to a collector named Gordon Mills, who had died in 1980. Mills's widow had since passed, and their children knew nothing of the figure beyond their father's inventory. Mills had originally acquired it in 1968 from a private sale in Philadelphia. Each discovery layered new questions over old certainties: who had sold it, who had owned it, and most importantly, why had it been preserved so meticulously? The deeper Porter dug, the more it became clear that this was not just a curiosity. It was part of a secret someone had gone to great lengths to hide. The Philadelphia lead quickly ran cold. The original seller had been a dealer who went out of business in the 1970s. Porter tracked down the dealer's former assistant, now retired, but she remembered only fragments. "It was so long ago," she said apologetically. "We handled hundreds of items. I remember thinking it was beautiful, but creepy. The boss said it came from an estate down south somewhere, but I don't know which one." Weeks passed as Porter traced ownership backward through time. Each lead dissolved into another dead-end sellers who had passed away. Estate records missing, memories faded. The trail grew colder with each decade he crossed. 1960s, 1950s, 1940s, until it seemed the origins of the figure were buried beneath layers of time. Meanwhile, the medical examiner's team worked tirelessly. The preservation technique was unprecedented. The body had been treated with a combination of formaldehyde-based embalming, desiccating chemicals, and a polymer resin applied meticulously to mimic lifelike skin. The results were stunning: hair follicles intact, fingerprints preserved, every tiny anatomical detail maintained. But the very skill that had preserved the body also obstructed their work. Standard DNA extraction techniques failed repeatedly. The chemicals had degraded most genetic material, and what remained was so saturated with preservation compounds that isolating usable samples was nearly impossible. The human story behind the figure was encoded in something almost impossible to recover. Samuel had once admired the figure for its lifelike detail, noting how it seemed to watch him. Now, each preserved hair and fingerprint was a clue to a life someone had tried to erase. The gaps in the ownership trail hinted at deliberate concealment. Someone had hidden this body, and someone might still be watching to make sure it stayed buried. Porter stood in the sterile chill of the morgue, his jaw tight as the chief medical examiner spoke. "We're trying everything," she said, pulling off her gloves. Different extraction methods, alternate solvents, even pre-1960s techniques. But with this level of chemical contamination and the time that's passed, she hesitated. "Detective, we may never get usable DNA." The words hung in the air like a verdict. The victim's identity was still a void. The only certainties were Grimm, a young black female, likely between 16 and 18. Time of death, sometime between 1961 and 1968. Her clothing was period accurate, her preservation materials chemically consistent with that era. But everything else, her name, her life, the reason she had been transformed into an object, remained sealed away, but without DNA. Without dental records to compare against, without any identifying marks or features that had survived the preservation process. They had no way to know who she was. Porter's frustration hardened into resolve. He expanded his search. For weeks his office filled with stacks of old missing person files, yellowed reports and faded photographs. He pulled cases from every state archive that would still take his call: teenage black girls listed as runaways, domestic absences unconfirmed. There were hundreds. Most had been ignored or forgotten. Many had never been followed up at all. Porter spent nights cross-referencing them by hand, building a database from scratch: age, location, last sighting, any mention of unusual circumstances. Patterns began to emerge. Clusters of disappearances near cities with civil rights protests. Girls last seen near certain travelling fairs and exhibitions. Cases closed quickly, without explanation. It was as if someone had been selecting victims from the edges of history. Young Women's Society had already decided not to miss. If stories like this scare you, good. They should, because this can happen to anyone. Don't just watch another person vanish. Learn how to protect yourself and the people you love. Check the pinned comment. It could be the one thing that saves you or someone close to you. Somewhere in those old files, buried among the forgotten faces, was the girl who had become the figure, and perhaps the person who had made sure she stayed hidden. If you made it this far, you clearly care about justice. Prove it. Type I stand for justice in the comments. The list on Porter's desk was heartbreakingly long. Rows of names, dates, and small black and white photographs of young faces frozen in time. Across the city, Sarah was following her own trail. The case had consumed her. Every evening, her dining table was buried under books on mortuary science, taxidermy manuals, and mid-century embalming guides. She believed the key wasn't just who the girl was, but how she'd been preserved. This wasn't done by an amateur, she told Porter during one of their weekly meetings at the precinct. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, but her tone was sharp, focused. Whoever did this had extensive knowledge: taxidermy, embalming, and chemistry. They used industrial-grade desiccants and formalin compounds. That kind of precision would have required equipment most people couldn't access. Porter leaned back in his chair, absorbing every word. So we're looking for someone with training. A funeral director, maybe a medical researcher. Someone who worked with the dead. Exactly, Sarah said. And not just that. Someone who had practice. You don't get results like this on a first try. The implication made Porter's stomach tighten. He shifted his focus southward, where the carbon dating pointed. If the girl had died between 1961 and 1968, and if her body had been preserved shortly after, then the person responsible had likely been active there during that period. He started digging through historical records, funeral homes, taxidermy studios, and medical programs known for anatomical research. That the deeper he searched, the more resistance he met. Records had been destroyed. Ownership transfers weren't documented. Some businesses had burned down, others had simply disappeared. Every lead ended the same way: silence. By midsummer, the investigation was running on fumes. Records from that era were missing, burned, or never kept. Businesses that might have held answers were long gone. Witnesses had died or moved away. Every promising thread dissolved into dust. Samuel felt the weight of it all. Though he knew he wasn't to blame, guilt had woven itself into his days. The girl's face, those glass eyes he once thought were art, haunted him every time he closed his own. He poured his wealth into action. Private investigators, genealogists, archival researchers, anyone who might uncover a trace of her past. He offered rewards, funded extended lab work, and personally covered the medical examiner's experimental DNA recovery efforts. It wasn't about reputation anymore. It was about redemption. One night in Porter's office, he sat beside Sarah, scanning through yellowed police reports. "I keep thinking about her family," Samuel said quietly. "Someone out there spent their whole life wondering where she went, if she was alive, if she suffered, if she ever came home. We can't even give them a name." Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. That same week, the call came. A breakthrough, but not from the lab. Dr. Sarah Collins, a Columbia University researcher specializing in missing persons from the civil rights era, had seen the case on the news. Her voice, when Porter answered, carried both excitement and caution. "There are so many cases from that period that never made it into official records," she said. Families who filed reports that were ignored. Police who didn't follow up. People who simply vanished, because no one cared enough to look. "I've been collecting oral histories. Stories that were never written down. I think one of them might match your victim." Dr. Collins' office at Columbia was cluttered with boxes of documents and a wall covered in photographs. Faces of the forgotten. She'd spent years gathering them, names that had never reached national headlines, girls who had been erased by neglect and silence. She opened her laptop and turned it toward Porter and Sarah. "I've been building a database," she said. Nearly 400 cases collected through interviews, church records, and family archives. Most were never properly investigated. No autopsies, no follow-up, just runaway stamped on a single page. Porter rubbed his temple, exhausted but attentive. 400, he repeated quietly. Martinez nodded. "When I cross-referenced your parameters, black girls, ages 15 to 19, vanished between 1961 and 1968. I found 12 that match, but 3 stand out." She clicked through the files one by one. All 3 disappeared in the summer of 1963. All were involved in civil rights youth organizing. All 3 cases were dismissed almost immediately as voluntary runaways, despite witness statements that said otherwise. Porter leaned closer. 3 photographs filled the screen. Grace Danvers, Asheville, North Carolina, vanished August 12, 1962. Faith Carter, Illinois, Chicago, vanished August 3, 1963. Mary Washington, Memphis, Tennessee, vanished June 2, 1963. "The one from Birmingham," Porter said. "Tell me about her." Martinez tapped the file, bringing up a faded black and white photo of a smiling teenager in a Sunday dress. "Grace Danvers," she said. 17 years old, honor student, volunteer at her church's youth outreach. She'd been helping organize voter registration drives for black residents. The day she vanished, she told her sister she was going to meet someone. She wouldn't say who. "What happened after?" Sarah asked. "The family filed a missing person report that same day. Birmingham PD took it, but there was no investigation. After 3 days, the file was closed. Official cause runaway. The family said she'd never have left voluntarily." Dr. Collins handed Porter a photograph. Not the one from police archives, but a candid shot captured at a church picnic in Birmingham. A young woman stood in sunlight, her smile shy but warm, her dress pressed and modest. Behind her, children played, unaware that time would freeze this moment forever. Porter felt it the instant he saw her. The faint curve of her jawline, the gentle symmetry of her features, details that echoed the scans he'd studied for weeks. The age, the year, the city. It all fit like pieces of a puzzle that had waited 60 years to be solved. "Does the family still live in Birmingham?" he asked. Martinez nodded. "The parents passed in the late 80s, but Grace's younger sister, Claire Danvers Johnson, she's still alive. Lives in North Carolina. She's been searching for Grace her entire life." Porter didn't wait. That afternoon, sitting in his car overlooking the Hudson, he dialed the number Collins had given him. The phone rang twice. "Hello? Mrs. Johnson, this is Detective Jack Bauer with the Georgia Police Department. I'm working a case that may be connected to your sister's disappearance in 1963. There was a long pause, so long Porter thought the line had gone dead. Then, softly, the sound of trembling breath. "You found her," she whispered. "I can't confirm anything yet, ma'am," Porter said gently. "But I need to ask you some questions about Grace, and I'll need a DNA sample from any living relatives. It's the only way to be sure." Another silence. Then Claire spoke, her voice steadier now, touched by something between hope and fear. "Detective, I've been waiting 62 years for this call. If you think you've found my sister, I'll give you whatever you need." Claire's voice wavered on the phone, yet beneath it was a resolve hardened by decades of silence. "I am her sister. My DNA would work, wouldn't it?" "For comparison, yes ma'am, it would," Porter replied. "But Mrs. Johnson, I need to prepare you. If this is Grace, the circumstances are unusual. I'd like to come to North Carolina to speak with you in person." There was a pause. Then steel entered her tone. "Detective, I have been waiting 59 years for this call. Whatever you have to tell me, I can handle it. When can you be here?" 2 days later, Porter, Sarah, and Samuel took a plane to North Carolina, stood at the doorstep of a small brick home in a quiet North Carolina neighborhood. Claire Danvers Johnson opened the door herself. She was graceful, silver-haired, and steady-eyed, carrying both the grief and dignity of someone who had waited half a lifetime for truth. Inside, her home was a shrine to Grace. Photographs covered every inch of space. Grace in a church choir, Grace leading a youth march, Grace smiling beside her classmates. One wall bore the weight of obsession: missing person flyers, yellowed newspaper cuttings, letters to politicians and police chiefs, private investigator notes. 59 years of persistence framed in fading ink and hope. As they sat in her living room, Porter began to explain everything: how the body had been found, how it was preserved, the investigation that led to her sister's name resurfacing after nearly 6 decades. His voice was calm but careful, knowing every word could reopen a wound that had never really healed. Claire listened in silence, her eyes fixed on a photo of Grace laughing under the summer sun. If her story broke your heart, let it show. Comment: she deserves more. Claire sat motionless as Porter spoke, her eyes fixed on the table but her mind somewhere far away, in a summer long gone, in a city that never truly left her. She didn't interrupt, didn't cry. But with each detail, her jaw tightened, her expression carved deeper into quiet resolve. When Porter finally stopped, the silence stretched between them. Then Claire stood, steady but deliberate, and crossed to a bookshelf lined with old albums. She pulled one free, its leather cover worn, corners frayed, and opened it on the coffee table. This was Grace's favorite dress, she said softly, pointing to a photograph. In it, a young woman stood beneath a church banner, wearing a burgundy silk gown that shimmered faintly even in the faded photo. She wore it to her graduation, saved every penny from her part-time job to buy it, said it made her feel grown up, like the world would have to take her seriously. Porter's throat tightened. He didn't need to look at Sarah to know they were both thinking the same thing. The preserved figure in Georgia had been wearing that exact same dress. Mrs. Johnson, Porter said carefully, we'll need a DNA sample from you for comparison, but I want to be upfront. The preservation process may have destroyed most of the genetic material. There's a chance we may never be able to confirm her identity through DNA. Claire closed the album and rested her hand on its cover. But you think it's her? Porter hesitated. The evidence is strong, the time frame, the physical match, the dress, the region. It all lines up, but until the test comes back we can't be absolutely certain. Claire looked up at him, her voice low but unwavering. All these years, my sister's body was being bought and sold like a decoration? Porter couldn't answer. The air in the room grew heavy, and as the team prepared to send Claire's DNA for analysis, none of them knew what the lab was about to uncover. Something that would make them question everything they thought they understood about who had preserved Grace Danvers. And why. Back in New York, while the sample processed, Sarah made a disturbing new discovery inside the preservation records. One that hinted Grace might not have been the only victim. Then take my DNA, Claire said firmly, her eyes steady on Porter. And while you're waiting for results, I'm going to tell you everything I know about the night Grace disappeared. Because if there's even a chance that's my sister, I want whoever did this to pay. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the ceiling fan. Porter nodded and Claire began to speak. Her voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of decades. She described Birmingham in the summer of 1963, the marches, the fear, the violence that seeped into every breath. She painted Grace as she had been: bold, stubborn, radiant with conviction. A girl who believed she could change the world even as the world pushed back with hate. Then Claire's voice faltered, and she looked down at her clasped hands. There's something I never told anyone. Not even my parents. Porter leaned forward, sensing the shift. Grace was seeing someone, Claire said quietly. A white boy. His name was Tom Gucci Jr. They met at an interfaith youth event and started writing letters after. I caught them once behind the church. She swore me to secrecy, said if anyone found out, especially his family, it could get her killed. Porter froze mid-note, his pen hovering above the page. Tom Gucci, he repeated slowly. That name sounds familiar. Claire nodded grimly. It should. The Guccis were one of the richest families in Birmingham. Tom Gucci Sr. owned factories, banks, half the city. Everyone knew his views, segregationist to the core. People whispered he had ties to the Klan, but nothing was ever proven. Porter exchanged a glance with Sarah. The connection was too significant to ignore. If her relationship with him was discovered, Sarah said quietly, that could have been a death sentence. Claire's voice dropped to a whisper. Grace knew the risk, but she loved him. And she believed he loved her too. Porter's mind was already racing. If the Gookies were involved, this wasn't just about a murder, it was about a cover-up buried deep in Birmingham's history. Claire's hands shook as she retrieved a small, worn diary from the shelf behind her. "This was Grace's," she said, her voice low. "I found it hidden in her room after she disappeared. I never showed it to the police. I was scared. I was just a kid. My sister was gone, and I feared if anyone knew about Tommy, something bad would happen to our family too." Porter accepted the diary reverently, flipping it open carefully. The pages smelled faintly of old paper and dust. The ink faded but legible. "Grace thought Tommy was different from his father," Claire continued. "She believed he loved her, that somehow they could make it work. The night before she disappeared, I overheard her on the phone. She whispered, but I caught fragments. She said something about tomorrow night and that they had to tell him, and everything would be okay. When I asked her about it the next morning, she wouldn't say. She said it was safer if I didn't know." The diary chronicled the months leading to her disappearance. Cautious entries, careful not to reveal too much. But the story was clear. Grace and Tommy were in love, plotting to run away together, to head north where they could exist openly. In the final weeks, however, Tommy seemed convinced his father could be reasoned with. Love, he believed, could overcome hate. Porter's eyes caught the last entry, dated July 6th. "Tomorrow, everything changes. Tommy says we're going to talk to his father together. He says his father has connections, that he can help us get to Georgia safely. I'm so scared, but Tommy promises it will be okay. He says his father loves him and will want him to be happy. God, please let this work. Please let us have our chance." Porter felt a chill run down his spine. The note wasn't just hope. It was a prelude to something far darker. Grace's words echoed the warning she'd whispered to Claire. "Be careful if anyone finds out." The danger had been present long before her disappearance. Whoever Tommy Gucci Sr. truly was, and whatever connections he wielded, Grace's plan to be free had set a chain of events in motion that would haunt generations. Porter closed the diary gently, the corners of the worn pages brushing his fingers. "Mrs. Johnson, why are you telling me this now? Why not back when Grace first disappeared?" Claire's eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. "I was a child and I was terrified. By the time I was old enough to understand that I should have spoken up, it felt too late. The case was closed. Grace was gone. Our parents were broken." She paused, swallowing hard. "I convinced myself it wouldn't matter, that nothing I said could bring her back." Her gaze locked on Porter's. "But if that's Grace, if my sister has been out there all this time, somebody killed her. Somebody took her from us and turned her into a thing, and I think I know who." Porter spent the following week chasing Claire's lead, but uncovering the Gucci family's past proved more complicated than he expected. Tom Gucci Sr. had died decades ago. Tom Jr. had passed under suspicious circumstances, officially labelled a suicide, though rumours of overdose and foul play persisted. The family fortune had been liquidated over the years, yet the Gucci name still commanded respect in Birmingham, their influence far-reaching and enduring. Porter reached out to the Birmingham Police Department, requesting records on Grace's disappearance and any files tied to the Guccis. The response was disheartening. The only document he received was a single missing person report, Grace Danvers, marked runaway, case closed, no follow-up and no mention of the Guccis. He leaned back, frustration knotting in his chest. Decades of influence, secrecy and lost time had left a void almost impossible to fill. The official record mirrored the earlier gaps Porter found tracing the doll's ownership. Another line of evidence buried or erased, as if someone had been guarding this secret for generations. Porter knew that if he wanted justice for Grace, he would have to pry open doors long sealed, confront whispers of power and privilege, and face a family that had spent decades keeping the truth hidden. Meanwhile, back in New York, Sarah's lab results were about to arrive, potentially confirming Grace's identity and setting off a chain reaction that could finally expose the full extent of the decades-old crime. He tried another approach, searching for people who'd worked for the Guccis. Most were dead or untraceable, but he found a former housekeeper, now in her 60s and living in a nursing home, who agreed to speak with him. "I worked for the Guccis from 1958 to 1966, she began. Mr. Gucci Sr., he was a hard man, cold, everything was about control, reputation, and keeping people in their place. His word was law in that house. Porter nodded. Do you remember the summer of 1963? Eve's eyes drifted to the window as if replaying the memory. I remember Tommy, she said softly. He wasn't like his father. Kinda. Used to sneak food to the staff, talk about college, music, things his father called nonsense. But that summer something was wrong. He looked nervous, pale, distracted. And Mr. Gucci, he was in a rage more often than not. The whole house felt like it was holding its breath. What were they fighting about? Porter asked gently. Eve's hands trembled slightly. I tried not to listen, but one day, I was dusting the hallway outside Mr. Gucci's study. I heard shouting. Tommy said something about love, about how it was his choice, his life. Then Mr. Gucci yelled back, You will not disgrace this family with that. I will not allow it. Then I heard glass shatter. Tommy ran out not long after, his face red, eyes swollen. I never saw him so broken. Porter's jaw tightened. Did you see anything unusual after that argument? The room had grown still except for the quiet hum of an old ceiling fan. Porter clicked his pen, sensing the shift in Eve's breathing. He knew she was holding something back. Did you see anything unusual around that time? He asked. Anyone coming to the house? Eve's eyes darted to the window again, her fingers tightening around the edge of her shawl. That night, July 14th, she whispered, I was working late. The Guccis were hosting a dinner party the next day, and I stayed to help with the preparations. Around 10 o'clock I saw Tommy's car pull into the drive. He wasn't alone. Porter leaned in. Who was with him? A young woman, Eve said. Couldn't see her face clearly, it was dark, but she didn't look happy to be there. Nervous, maybe even frightened. Tommy led her toward the side entrance, the one that connects to Mr. Gucci's private study. They didn't use the front door. Porter's pulse quickened. Did you see her leave? Eve shook her head. No, I finished up and left just before midnight. His car was still out front, and I could see the light on in the study window, but when I came in the next morning, that door was locked. Mr. Gucci told us he'd had a migraine and wasn't to be disturbed. He didn't come out all day. Meals were left at the door. She paused, her voice trembling. And Tommy, he looked hollow, like someone had died. He was pale, shaking, barely spoke a word. A few days later he packed a bag and left Birmingham. Nobody saw him again for almost a year. Porter's mind raced. Did anyone else notice what was going on? Eve gave a slow, knowing nod. Everyone noticed, but no one dared to say it out loud. That house had rules, unspoken ones. You kept quiet or you disappeared. Porter remembered Samuel describing the mysterious woman in the portrait. Her eyes, frozen in fear. It wasn't just art anymore, it was testimony. If you care about stories like this one, subscribe before you leave. It's a small act, but it keeps their memories alive and their truths uncovered. Eve's voice lingered in Porter's head long after he left the nursing home. You didn't question Mr. Gucci. Not if you wanted to stay safe. It wasn't just fear. It was loyalty born from decades of silence. That silence was proving harder to crack than any locked door. He spent the next week chasing ghosts. Every former staff member he tracked down was either long gone, unwilling to talk, or claimed to remember nothing of value. Those still alive repeated the same cautious refrain: the Guccis were powerful, and questioning them came with consequences. Even in old age they spoke as if the man might still hear them. The wall around the family wasn't made of stone. It was built from fear. Meanwhile, the DNA results dragged on like a wound that refused to close. Porter called the lab every few days, his patience thinning. The lab director, a soft-spoken man with greying hair, repeated the same explanation. We're dealing with extremely degraded samples, he said. The preservation chemicals did their job too well. They protected the bones, but they shredded the DNA. We're amplifying what fragments we can, but it's slow. You might get partial markers, enough for a probable match, but a full ID? I can't promise that. Porter left the call with a mix of dread and exhaustion. He had everything but proof. A diary, witness testimony, motive, timeline. It all pointed to the same night, the same house, the same man. But without DNA, it was all just smoke and suspicion. Each night he sat by the case files, rereading the last diary entry. Tomorrow everything changes. He wondered if Tommy ever made it out of that house alive in spirit, or if that night broke them both. You watched the story. You felt the fear, but if you scroll past without doing anything, you're no safer than they were. Protect yourself, protect your family. The guide in the pinned comment could be what stands between you and becoming the next missing headline. Porter shifted his focus. If he couldn't find proof through DNA or witnesses, maybe the body itself could speak in another way. Whoever preserved Grace hadn't just hidden her. They'd showcased her, turned her into something unholy and permanent. That kind of work required precision, knowledge and access to specialized chemicals. Sarah's research gave him a starting point: undertakers, morticians, even medical technicians who might have had the skill to preserve human tissue that meticulously. Porter dug through old directories, scanned archives, and sent letters to surviving businesses, but every path seemed to end the same way: closed records, dead witnesses, burned down buildings, until one name began surfacing again and again: Dr. Peter Vogel, a German-born preservationist who'd run a small studio in Texas between 1946 and 1963. His clients included funeral homes, medical schools, and occasionally private collectors. The more Porter read, the more he felt a chill creeping up his spine. Vogel had been praised for his lifelike artistry, the same phrase Sarah had used when describing Grace's preserved remains. The obituary Porter found was brief: Dr. Peter Vogel, 68, German-born craftsman and naturalist, passed away in 1965 from heart failure. Survived by no immediate family. Studio closed. Still, Porter managed to locate two of Vogel's former employees, now elderly men living in different states. One agreed to speak with him. Vogel was a genius, the man said over the phone, his voice cracked with age. But he was strange, obsessed. He'd work on a single specimen for weeks, perfecting veins, eyelashes, even fingerprints. Said life was sacred, but he wanted to capture it forever. Porter scribbled notes. Did he ever do private work? Unofficial commissions? Porter thought of the Gucci estate, of Claire's trembling voice when she said, he had connections to the clan. Alabama, money, secrets. It lined up too neatly to ignore. Did he ever work with human remains? Porter asked. The man hesitated, shifting in his seat. Sometimes, yeah. He did anatomical prep work for medical schools, legal stuff. But there were rumors, whispers in the business that he took private commissions on the side, projects he never discussed. A few times I came in early and caught him working on something he covered up fast. Said it was a delicate restoration, but... He trailed off, uneasy. It didn't feel right. Whatever he was doing, it wasn't just taxidermy. Porter leaned in. What about the summer of 1963? Anything unusual around that time? The man shook his head. Can't say. That was before my time. I didn't start with him until 1966. Porter tracked down another former employee, Vogel's bookkeeper from 1959 to 1968. She remembered even less. Her surviving ledgers showed only normal business expenses, standard clients, nothing out of the ordinary. If Vogel had ever taken private work from the Gukis, or anyone, he'd been paid in cash and left no trace. Another lead gone cold. Another path that vanished into silence. Porter was starting to understand the cruel logic of cold cases, how time erodes not just evidence, but truth itself. Without witnesses, without documents, without something physical to hold on to. Even the best theories dissolved into speculation. Then, months later, his phone rang. It was the lab director. Her tone told him everything before she even spoke. We got partial markers, she said. Not a full profile, the sample's too degraded. But what we have is enough for comparison. Detective, it's not definitive, but the recovered markers are consistent with a sibling relationship. Statistically, there's an 85 to 90% probability your remains and the reference sample belong to sisters. Not certainty, but close enough to matter. Porter called Claire immediately. She answered on the first ring. Mrs. Johnson, he said carefully, we have results. They aren't conclusive, but they're strong. The genetic markers that survived match closely with yours. There's a high probability the remains are Grace's. Claire didn't speak right away. When she finally did, her voice trembled. High probability. That means there's still doubt, doesn't it? I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnson, Porter said quietly. I wish I could tell you it was absolute. She cut in softly. But you believe it's her. Porter hesitated, thinking of the floral dress, the timeline, the matching age and build, the degraded but persuasive DNA markers. He thought of Eve Sanders' confession, of the diary, of everything he'd pieced together from that summer in Birmingham. "Yes, ma'am," he said at last. "I believe it's her." Claire drew a long breath, steadying herself. "Then I want to bring my sister home, Detective. However long it takes, whatever needs to be done, Grace deserves that." By late July, the medical examiner released the remains to Claire's care. Porter had hoped to uncover more before that moment, to find out who was responsible, to deliver some form of justice, but the trail had gone cold. Every clue had led nowhere. He met with Claire, Samuel and Sarah in Claire's North Carolina home to talk about what came next. The air was heavy, the walls lined with decades of photographs and questions still without answers. Porter's shoulders sagged slightly. "I don't have enough for charges," he admitted. "Tom Gucci Sr. is dead. Tommy is dead. Without physical evidence linking them to Grace's death, without witnesses willing to testify, and without definitive proof that these remains are hers, no prosecutor would touch this case." Claire's voice was flat, edged with quiet fury. "So they get away with it. My sister is murdered, her body turned into an object sold for profit, and no one answers for it." "I'm not giving up," Porter said, voice firm. "This case stays open. I'll keep investigating, keep digging for evidence. But right now, there's nothing more I can do legally. I'm sorry." Samuel leaned forward. "What if we shift the approach? Criminal justice may be out of reach, but we can still honor Grace's story. We can make sure the world knows what happened, the injustice she endured, and maybe prevent something like this from happening again." Sarah nodded. "I've been working on verification protocols for museums and collectors, ways to confirm that specimens or unusual acquisitions are really what they claim to be. If we get these standards adopted broadly, it could stop other victims from being hidden in plain sight." The room fell silent for a moment, each of them processing the weight of truth and the limits of justice. But the determination to act, even in the face of impunity, was unmistakable. Claire studied each of them, her gaze steady. "You barely knew Grace. You didn't have to care about what happened to her. Yet you've spent the last 4 months searching for answers, chasing justice. Why?" Porter spoke first. "Because she deserved better than she got. Her case should have been investigated properly back in '63, and it wasn't. Even now, even if we can't prosecute, we can at least acknowledge the crime and honor the victim." Sarah added, "Because Grace's story is part of a bigger pattern. How many other black girls vanished in that era, dismissed as runaways? How many families were ignored when they begged for help? Too many cases were abandoned simply because the victims weren't seen as important. Her story matters because it represents all of them." Samuel hesitated, then said, "I think about having her remains in my home for months, admiring the detail, treating her like an object. It makes me sick. The least I can do now is make sure her story is told and remembered correctly. It's not justice, but it's something." A heavy silence fell over the room. Each of them knew the fight wasn't over, and yet, for the first time, there was clarity, a shared purpose to honor Grace beyond the tragedy that had consumed decades. Claire nodded slowly. "Then we tell the story. We make sure people know Grace Danvers' name and what happened to her. We can't change the past, but maybe we can make sure it isn't forgotten." The funeral took place in mid-August, at the same Birmingham church where Grace had once organized youth meetings. The building was filled beyond what Claire had expected. What she had anticipated to be a quiet, private service had turned into something far larger. The story of Grace Danvers had resonated. Civil rights activists attended, friends and acquaintances who had known Grace decades ago, and strangers who had been moved by her story and wanted to pay their respects. Journalists came as well, documenting this small, overdue act of justice for a life that had been ignored for far too long. Claire delivered the eulogy, her voice unwavering even through the tears. "My sister Grace died because she believed in love and equality. She died because she dared to imagine a world different from the one she lived in. For years, those who killed her lived freely, their names respected, their lives untouched, their deaths peaceful. That is not justice. But today, we remember Grace. Today, we say her name. Today, we acknowledge that her life mattered, that she was loved, and that her death was a crime. Maybe it's not justice, but it's a start. After the service, Porter, Samuel, and Sarah remained in the church cemetery, watching as Grace's remains were finally laid to rest beside her parents. A modest headstone marked the grave Grace Danvers, beloved daughter and sister, civil rights activist. Her voice was silenced, but her story will be remembered. "What happens now?" Samuel asked softly. "The investigation stays open," Porter replied. "I'm still looking into Vogel's history, trying to uncover any records that might connect him to the Guccis. There's a grandson, Jimmy Gucci, still in Birmingham. He won't speak to me, but I haven't given up. And if you never find proof, then at least we've done this much. We've identified Grace, shared her story, and given her family some measure of closure." Porter paused. "It's not justice. It's not enough. But it's more than she had before." They stood together in silence, the Alabama heat pressing down, the weight of decades of unresolved injustice hanging heavy around them. Sarah spoke up, her voice low but urgent. "There's something I haven't told you. I've been reviewing records of unusual preservation work from the 50s and 60s, cross-referencing them with missing persons cases. I found 3 other cases that resemble Grace's, 3 other young black girls who disappeared during that era, all dismissed as runaways, all possibly subjected to the same fate." Porter's head snapped toward her. 3 others? "I can't prove anything," she said quickly. "They're patterns, coincidences maybe, but the similarities are striking. Same time frame, same demographics, same type of cases. One instance even shows up in an old auction catalogue from the 70s, a life-size Victorian preservation specimen. The description matches the preservation technique used on Grace." "Where is that piece now?" Samuel asked, unease creeping in. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "The auction house went out of business decades ago. Their records are scattered or lost. It could be anywhere." A cold weight settled in Samuel's stomach. "You're saying there could be other victims out there, still bought and sold, still hidden in collections?" "It's possible," Sarah said quietly, though her voice carried resolve. "I'm still investigating, looking for links, but I think Grace may not be the only one." Porter pulled out his phone, tapping out notes. "Send me everything you have, names, dates, locations, any documentation. If there are others, we owe them the same chance we gave Grace to be identified, to be laid to rest properly." Sarah frowned. "It could take years. Records are incomplete. The trail is decades old and resources are limited." Claire stepped closer, her gaze firm. "Then it takes years. Grace waited decades to come home. If there are others like her, they deserve the same, to be found, named, mourned. She met each of their eyes. I'm 75. I don't know how much time I have left, but I'll spend it making sure Grace's story, and the stories of others, aren't forgotten. The people who did this are gone. We can't bring them to justice, but we can refuse to let their crimes be erased. We can honor the victims. We can keep searching for the truth." Porter nodded slowly. "Then that's what we do. We keep looking, keep digging, keep telling her story." As they walked out of the cemetery, Porter's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was his captain. He answered, listening silently, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the news. After a long moment he hung up. "The Birmingham Police Department just released a statement," he said, voice heavy. "They're officially closing Grace's case. Her death is now classified as a cold case homicide, with no active leads, no suspects. They aren't pursuing it any further." Claire closed her eyes briefly, a flicker of pain crossing her face. When she opened them, the resolve was unmistakable. "Then we continue without them. We've come this far on our own. We keep going. Mrs. Johnson, I'm with the NYPD, not Birmingham. My reach is limited. I can only do so much." "Then do what you can, Detective Porter. And I'll do what I can. Together, maybe we can uncover some measure of truth." They made their way to the cars under the late afternoon sun, the heat heavy, and the cemetery shadows stretching long. Grace Danvers's grave was now covered in flowers, more than Claire had ever imagined, more than seemed possible for someone who had been forgotten for decades. Yet the story was far from finished. 3 other potential victims remained out there, waiting to be discovered. Vogel's full history had yet to be unraveled. The Gucci family's ties and crimes were still wrapped in secrecy, and somewhere among private collectors and antique dealers, other horrors might still be hidden in plain sight. Porter drove back to the hotel, already mapping his next steps in his mind. He would request Vogel's records from every state where he had operated. He would dig into the Gucci family's financial transactions from the era. He would contact every funeral home, taxidermy studio, and medical school that might hold clues. It would take time. It would be grueling. Many leads would end in dead ends. He might never obtain definitive proof of what happened to Grace or identify the other possible victims. The perpetrators were gone. Justice in the conventional sense was out of reach. Porter knew from years on the force that sometimes the act of searching was justice in itself, sometimes making sure the truth was seen, refusing to let it be buried, and telling the story that demanded to be heard. That was its own kind of reparation. Grace Danvers had been just 16 when her life was stolen. She had ambitions, dreams of higher education, a belief in fairness and love, and the hope that change was possible. Instead, she was murdered for those convictions, her body treated as a collectible for decades while her family endured years of grief and unanswered questions. Now, finally, she was home. Her name was remembered, her story acknowledged. It wasn't the justice she deserved in the traditional sense, but it was something real, and if others had suffered the same fate, Porter was determined the search wouldn't stop. Every victim would be found, every family would learn the truth, and every story would be brought into the light. Porter parked in the hotel lot and sat for a moment, eyes on the stack of file folders beside him. Grace Danvers' case sat on top, accompanied by 3 others that might be connected. Cold cases, decades old, full of unanswered questions. Yet questions were a beginning. They sparked investigation, and investigation uncovered fragments of truth. Not always justice, but truth mattered, and sometimes it was enough. He picked up the folders and stepped inside, already mapping his next moves. The search wouldn't end here. Somewhere out there, other victims were waiting to be identified, to be remembered, to finally be brought home. Grace Danvers' story had reached its close, but the wider tale, of forgotten victims, buried crimes, generations of injustice and families who never gave up, was far from finished. Detective Jack Bauer was determined to see it through, wherever it led. Thank you for watching. This is only part of the story. If you want a part 2 where we reveal the full, shocking truth behind this crime, let us know in the comments, and if you scroll past without subscribing, you might be the villain this story was warning about.